So over the few years, we received some questions like, why if I send an A4 to my BRENSO, it plays an A5 or A3, something like that? Or what if I am recording an A4 on the USTA sequencer and it records on A3, A2? All the questions are connected and depend on the arbitrary nature of notes. The short answer is that there is not a standard, and you should care more about how your oscillator track than what octave corresponds to what signal you use to control the oscillator. A problem may arise only if your oscillator isn't capable of reaching a certain frequency that it should reach. How it reaches that, meaning through which means, through which control signal, is not necessarily a problem. The long answer is this one. So as you may know, in the Western musical tradition, we have 12 notes, and after the 12th, the 13th note is actually a repetition of the first one, but an octave higher, an octave being a simple doubling in frequency. So for example, if we start from C and we go to B, after the B we will have a C again, but an octave higher. Now the way we label notes in the West only gives us information about that note in relation to the others, but doesn't give us much more details about how high that note should be. For example, if I say F, I know it's not an E, I know it's not a D, but I don't know how high or how low that F should be, unless I note it down on a score, of course. So if you have ever played an electronic instrument or a MIDI instrument or used a tuner, recorded on a DAW, you would know that there is a note named A4 whose frequency is 440 Hz. This is the result of two separate standardization processes that addressed two specific issues. One was being able to make most instruments play together, and two was being able to specifically determine the octave of a note or the range of an instrument, like finding an unambiguous way to understand how high is an F, for example. So before tuners were invented, there wasn't a standard tuning practice, and the frequency of an A could vary a lot between different countries, different cities, or even different orchestras. A became the standard note used to tune most instruments together, and then during the 19th and the 20th century, the frequency of 440 Hz to the middle A, like somewhere in the middle of our hearing range, became a sort of a standard and was gradually adopted in the Western countries. Today, most of the music recorded in the West uses the reference pitch of the middle A at 440 Hz, and you are also quite sure that if you buy two instruments from two different manufacturers, they could get along quite well. But this is, of course, a standardization process, and it is just a convention that is adopted, but nothing prevents you from using a different A frequency like 432 or 415 if you play antique music, or higher pitched A like 450. Why not? But the other issue was more related to composition and orchestration. Every instrument has a different range, which means that it has a different number of notes that it can play, and also different extension, like how many octaves and which ones it covers. Almost every instrument is capable of playing more than one octave, and according to Western musical tradition, the 12 notes that divide an octave are called the same way regardless of which octave they are played in. So for example, these two frequencies are both Cs, one just being an octave higher because it is twice the frequency of the other. So it often happens that an instrumentalist can play the same note on different octaves, or different versions of the same note, higher or lower. But because every instrument has a different range, the highest C of an instrument might be the lowest one of another, and the two instrumentalists might perceive the same pitch in two completely different ways. Things are much more complicated by transposed instruments, like for example the trumpet, because its default note is B flat, but trumpet players write it and call it C, even if for the rest of the world is a B flat. So for example, in some instruments with a very strong musical tradition like the harp, the notes are actually named in the opposite way. So you start from the octave 0, which is the highest one, and you go down to the 7th octave. So in order to avoid ambiguity and to pinpoint the exact position of a note across different octaves, something called the scientific pitch notation was developed. Scientific pitch notation just adds a number after the note name that refers to the octave it is playing. The first octave is numbered 0 and it starts from the C roughly at 16 Hz, which is oftentimes the threshold of human hearing, like the point at which you can still perceive a fundamental tone. So the first octave is C0, C sharp 0, D0, and so on up to B0. Then the next C, which is around 32 Hz, is called C1, and the other notes and octaves are numbered accordingly. This way, the middle C on the piano becomes our C4. So if we tune our instrument to the standard tuning that we mentioned earlier, our A at 440 Hz sits on the 5th octave, so it becomes our A4. Please note that the scientific pitch notation doesn't care about the tuning frequency, so you can still tune your A at whatever frequency you want and still call it A4. And now let's go back to electronic music instruments and the MIDI protocol. So the MIDI protocol outputs 128 notes, but they are not technically notes, they are just control signals that change the frequency of our oscillator 128 times. The MIDI itself doesn't carry any frequency information. It's not a sound, it's a control. Anyway, 128 notes are far more than any musical instruments on earth. They span over roughly more than 10 octaves and they pretty much exceeds the human hearing range. However, most MIDI instrument manufacturers adopted the scientific pitch notation to name their notes. So their A4 becomes the 69th note, roughly in the middle. But since this extension is way higher than the one of a piano, for example, the lowest MIDI note, the 0 control voltage, becomes a C an octave below the C0, so it's like a C minus 1. The point of this discussion is that scientific pitch notation is very useful when we want to communicate a note in an absolute way, an unambiguous way. But still, within each instrument, we can still call the notes related to its extension and to its user practices. So let's finally come to modular synthesizers. In a modular synthesizer, we achieve different pitches by changing the oscillator's frequencies. We can use the frequency knob, but it's quite impractical. So we can use an external device to send pre-programmed control voltages that correspond to precise increments. So it's not quite easy to determine the range of a modular synthesizer because there are two factors into play: the range of the controller and the range of the oscillator. So if an oscillator goes from here all the way up here, it doesn't mean that with a proper offset it just cannot go even beyond those limits. You can think of the controller as a guitar's fretboard that allows you to play only a certain number of notes, and the oscillator as the string. You can tune the string up or down and expand or reduce the extension of a guitar, but the notes you can play are always the same. In case of the USTA, our main volt per octave controller, its range is 10 volts, so 10 octaves. We number them from C0 at 0 volt all the way up to C10 at 10 volts, because it is more practical, but also because, as you can see here, we have only 3 digits as a limit to express the note. So using the conventional scientific pitch notation would have caused us to have the need for 4 digits all the way down to C minus 1. But this doesn't imply that a C4 on the USTA should correspond to a C4 in scientific pitch notation and standard pitch. It just means that it is the 5th C that USTA can output. But it is up to you to choose which note assigned to it. For example, if I patch my track 1, go here, scroll up to C4, I don't even know which frequency is this one. I can tune it down from here and up to here. And I can further change the offset from the USTA. So it's totally up to which range you want to play, how you are used to tune your oscillator to choose how to tweak this knob and assign this CV. It depends on the context, and in most of my videos I don't even bother to tune it to a C. But it is not over, because USTA allows you to output also bipolar voltages. So the lowest voltage would be -5 volts instead of 0. The C5 then becomes 0 volts. It is all relative to your need. So for example, I access the track menu, I scroll until I find the CVA range and assign it to bipolar, and you will experience an instant pitch drop because the same note is now 5 volts lower. In those circumstances, you may want to tune your oscillator to the 0 volt, which is now C5. So this is the 0 volt. And you can hear that whether I leave or remove the patch cable with the volt per octave offset, the pitch is gonna stay the same. Otherwise, if I set it to bipolar, and go back to a similar value, I will drop down very much. So if we use an external keyboard, we access the composition mode and we patch the gate here and the CV here, we can write down a sequence. However, if this might be my middle C, which is recorded as a C3, even though if we were to use the scientific mid notation, the scientific pitch notation, this would be a C4, and same way all the way down to my C-1, which is recorded as a C0. But the point is that I should aim at having the same signal going in and going out. So you may find that USTA's C0 corresponds to the keyboard C-1, and conversely, that its A4 is in fact USTA's A5. But that is okay. Most controllers can still name the control signal using scientific notation or other systems. And this shouldn't be an issue at all. You might use the scientific pitch notation to name the notes that come out of your synthesizer, not the control signals that goes into it. So for example, most Yamaha keyboard name the middle C as C3, in the same way does Max MSP or even GarageBand. Not an issue. If the frequency that comes out of it is around 260 something hertz, you can still name it C4 using scientific pitch notation. The scope of this video is that saying that A4 is at 440 Hz is nothing but a convention that can make people understand each other more easily under certain circumstances. If you need 1 volt, 2 volt, 3 volts, 0, -5, whatever to achieve 440 Hz, that's okay. It will still be an A4 for the one who listened to it. This video, of course, implies that we use scales made of 12 nodes equally spaced across 1 octave. That's not always the case, but this might be the topic of another video. Until then, I hope you found this video useful, and I will see you next time.